SEP Fanfic Readings presents Accidental Proposal by CJRed. Chapter 6. Back to School. The 8th year sat together on the train. Theo and Hermione sat next to each other, both of them a little bleary-eyed as they had stayed up rather late, and poor Theo hadn't gotten much sleep in the last few days. Hermione had sat down and immediately told all of the other 8th years about what had happened, including about how the elf had changed her eyes back without her permission. Neville looked a bit sick and had to leave the room. Hermione knew it was because he didn't approve of her father's choice to do what his mother had wanted, to take Hermione away from her mother. She watched him walk away, her eyes sad. Neville had lost his parents, too. The other returning Gryffindors were Seamus and Dean, and they both seemed not to know what to say. So, in true Gryffindor fashion, they said rather the wrong thing and then apologized and changed the subject. The returning Ravenclaws were Cho Chang and Michael Corner, who appeared to be dating. They both gave Hermione sad smiles, but offered their support. The Hufflepuffs were Hannah Abbott, Susan Bones, and Ernie Macmillan. Hannah shook her head, wiping tears away, as Susan Bones hugged Theo, telling him how lucky it was to at least have found his sister. Ernie might be a badger, but he was also a guy, so he kind of shuffled and offered words of encouragement to the two of them. Theo gave a grateful, if not rather uncomfortable, nod at all the support they were receiving. Hermione smiled at him, a bit weakly. She had expected this, but it was clear her brother had not. Surprisingly, there were 6 Slytherins returning. Pansy Parkinson, Daphne Greengrass, Tracy Davis, Blaise Zabini, Draco Malfoy, and of course Theo. The whole Slytherin group had already been told about this development, and although not as mushy with their support as the others had been, they made it clear that they were behind Theo and Hermione completely. However, the Slytherins seemed to expect that there would be problems, while the others thought it wouldn't be a huge deal that Hermione, the war hero and best friend of Harry Potter, was confirmed to be the daughter of a Death Eater. Seamus laughed at Pansy when she said it would be a disaster because he thought it impossible that anyone would dare attack Hermione. Hermione herself wasn't exactly sure what would happen. Seeing the upset look on her brother's face, she decided to change the subject and ask if anyone knew what had happened to the rest of their class, as many of them were now missing. Cho told them that most of the 8th year Ravenclaws had decided to go to other magical schools. Arnie confirmed this was the case with the Hufflepuffs as well. The Gryffindors had also scattered, it seemed, although not to other schools apparently. Once this topic of discussion was exhausted, they all sat in their robes looking a bit nervous until finally Cho broke the quiet. "Did you see that it said not to wear the house colors?" Neville, who had returned a short while ago, looked up and frowned. "I think she's going to resort us." Everyone was silent until Pansy said harshly, "I will leave if she does." Hannah Abbott actually nodded, agreeing with her. "I will too. I'm proud to be a Puff." Hermione sighed. "I think that's what she is trying to show us. We should be proud to be any of the houses." Pansy glared at her. "So you would choose not to be a Gryffindor?" Hermione shrugged and then said quietly, "I was almost put in Slytherin at first, and then Ravenclaw, before the hat put me in Gryffindor, Pansy." Everyone stared at her in shock as Theo threw an arm around her. "Don't worry, sis. We will make a snake out of you yet." Hermione laughed and looked up to see that Draco Malfoy was staring at her, his face taut. She mouthed, "What?" at him, but he shook his head and looked away frowning. Theo sighed and leaned in, saying, "He doesn't like me touching you." Hermione gave him a confused look. "But you're my brother." Theo just shrugged and sighed, leaning back and folding his arms to stare out the window. She would never be sure how they had done it, but the announcement of her engagement had not gone out with the one revealing that she was a knot. When she had asked Theo about it, he just shrugged and said that it was good to be rich and even better to be twice as rich. She took that to mean that both he and Draco had thrown lots of gold at the situation. When they got off the train, Theo kept his hand on her elbow, pulling her after him into a carriage with Draco and Blaise already inside. Hermione sighed and sat back, watching Blaise enchant the door to remain shut. "I was going to sit with Neville," Hermione said, irritated. Draco snorted and Blaise shrugged. Theo smiled at her. "So, am I going to Gryffindor, or are you coming to Slytherin?" Hermione stared at Theo as if he had lost his mind. "Excuse me?" Theo laughed. "Draco and our fathers were on the board of directors, Hermione. We know what's going on." Hermione sat back, folding her arms. "Okay, so what is going on, and why wouldn't you just tell all of us on the train?" Blaise shrugged. "We were sworn to secrecy." Hermione pointed at Blaise. How do you know? Blaise shrugged. My mother informed me before I left home. Hermione sighed. So what's going on then? Theo smirked. McGonagall is going to allow the 8th years to choose their own house. Hermione gasped. But why? Draco shrugged, looking annoyed. Inter-house unity. Blaise snorted, smirking as well. We can also sit at any table we wish during our mealtimes and have full access to the entire castle, including each other's common rooms. Theo nodded. And as we are all of age and fought in a war, they aren't even going to enforce a curfew, and we can leave school on weekends to go to Hogsmeade whenever we wish. Hermione gasped. Wow. Blaise grunted. Could have given us our own bloody section so we don't have to put up with the first years. Draco smirked. What the hell do you think the room of requirement will be? Hermione smiled. Neville could figure that out. Blaise sighed. If he invites us. Hermione glared. He will, she said, crossing her arms. Theo chuckled. So, shall I become a lion then? Hermione shook her head. No, please don't. I will be fine, and you are too perfect as a snake. Theo sat back down, grinning. Thank you. Hermione rolled her eyes and looked at the other two. Will you change houses? Draco looked appalled as Blaise laughed. No Slytherin would change houses. Theo grunted. Davis might. Never knew why she was in Slytherin anyway. They all argued over who might change houses for the rest of the trip. When they got to the castle, it was to find the headmistress standing there, looking annoyed. You lot, get in here, she said, gesturing to the 8th years and to a classroom off the entryway. They all piled in, looking weary. Well, everyone who didn't know what was going on. Hermione was still anxious, though, because she wasn't sure how this was going to play out. McGonagall looked them all over. Now, this is rather unprecedented, letting students redo a year, but in this case we simply must. NEWTs are simply too important to ignore. We gave those in 5th year the option of retaking exams, and they all did rather well. She paused and then said, Given all of your age, and the fact that most of you are war veterans, we are adjusting a few of the rules and implementing others. She pulled out a piece of parchment and said, Right. First, there is no curfew for you. Second, you are welcome to leave the castle on weekends. Third, no dating underage students without parental consent. Fourth, no hexing underage students. No exceptions. Her eyes twitched and she said, Charm them however you wish, but nothing permanent or harmful. She looked up and saw Neville's pained expression. Longbottom, Miss Lovegood's father sent his permission for you to court his daughter. Neville relaxed and nodded. Hermione grinned at him, winking. McGonagall rolled up the parchment and said, Now, about houses. Each dormitory had the head of house sections expanded. You will all be sharing those in your respective houses. Cho spoke up. May we keep our own houses? McGonagall nodded. You can choose whichever house you'd like. I want you to take some time to ponder on that before you decide. Everyone nodded, looking around as if trying to ascertain if anyone would change houses. I would request, however, that you remember that we are trying to promote inter-house unity, so at mealtimes it would please me if you sat at a different table than you have before. Everyone again nodded, and the headmistress smiled at them. Well, off you go. Neville, Hermione, a word. Neville and Hermione stayed behind, shifting a bit as they waited for the room to clear. McGonagall tossed a silencing charm at the door once it shut behind Theo. Hermione, I have heard all about your news this summer. How are you doing? Hermione sighed. I was fine until the elf changed my eyes. Apparently my father gave me a potion to keep them brown. I have to admit that was rather unsettling, although I suppose it's not surprising that I have blue eyes like both my parents. She saw McGonagall flinch. Yes, it is startling. She paused and then seemed to blister on. If you need anything, I don't want you to hesitate to ask. But I have to know if the bit about the Malfoy boy is true. Hermione fidgeted and then nodded. Yes, we are engaged. Neville looked at her in horror as McGonagall closed her eyes. Well, this complicates things. That magic is ancient, Miss Greydiger. Hermione gave Neville a pleading look and said, It wasn't my intention. Neville nodded understandingly. Ron and Harry know? Hermione shook her head. We haven't told anyone yet, Neville. It's complicated. McGonagall sighed. If you need anything, Madame Porphyry of course will help you. Hermione gasped, understanding what McGonagall was saying, and flushed bright red. Next it was Neville's turn. I understand you and Miss Lovegood also have an understanding. Neville nodded, flushing. Well, I want to be informed that though she is underage, Madame Pomfrey is also at your disposal. Neville went in an even darker shade of red and nodded again. McGonagall seemed to deflate a bit. Now, I was wondering if I could impose upon you two to do me a favor. Hermione had a very good idea what that favor was. You want us to change houses? She sighed. No, I just wish for you to set a good example for your fellow students. Neville nodded. We can do that. Hermione nodded in agreement, and the headmistress swept out, hurrying off to the feast. Hermione sighed and looked up at Neville. Congratulations on your engagement, she said, smiling. He snorted and dropped his arm over her shoulder. Thanks. Now, how did you end up engaged to Draco Malfoy? Hermione shook her head. Too much wine and not enough information. When she got the story to Neville, he was laughing. Oh, man, he must feel like a total brat. She nodded. Yes, I suppose so. How did you avoid this with Luna? Neville sighed. I gave her jewelry, and she accepted. That's how you get around it without doing the counterspell. Hermione groaned. This is so stupid, Neville. He gave her an understanding look. I know. Come on, I'm starving. When they made it into the great hall, it was to find everyone already seated. Neville smiled at her and moved off to sit with Luna, who had clearly saved a space for him. Hermione hesitated before she caught Draco's eyes. They were dark and almost staring her. She sighed as she realized that none of the other eighth years had sat at the Slytherin table, although Blaise was sitting bold as you please at the new Gryffindor table with Ginny Weasley, who she knew he was familiar with, thanks to Quidditch. And Tracy Davis was at the Hufflepuff table looking serene, while Daphne Greengrass was sitting by her sister at the Ravenclaw table. Smiling at a few students who were trying to get her attention, Hermione rushed over and sank between Theo and Draco. Why didn't you two sit somewhere else? She asked under her breath, as Theo poured her pumpkin juice and Draco handed her a napkin. We like our table, Theo said with a smirk. Hermione gave her brother a knowing look. No, you knew I would sit by you, so you stayed here, to make me sit with snakes. Theo grunted, not looking at all guilty. That too. What did McGonagall want? Hermione flushed and then whispered, To know if my engagement was true. Then she told me that Madame Pomfrey was available to me for anything I needed. She gave him a long look so that he understood what she was referring to, simply because she was annoyed that she had to have that conversation with her former professor, and making her brother share in her embarrassment seemed fitting. Theo hissed, his face going dark, and glaring at Draco, who was looking at him curiously. What? Draco asked, raising an eyebrow. Theo, however, pulled the smirking Hermione closer to him and said, Nothing. Hermione giggled and jerked away from her brother. Stop it, Theo. I won't need it anyway. I learned how to do the charm myself 4th year, she hissed under her breath. Theo knocked over his pumpkin juice. What? She raised an eyebrow at him and waved her wand, clearing up the mess while everyone looked at him curiously. Theo, she teaches every girl the spell when they start their menses, she whispered before kissing his cheek. Stop being a brat. He sank back, still frowning, but nodded while Draco gave them an annoyed look. What the hell is going on? Hermione waved him off. Not a thing. Why didn't you go sit somewhere else? Draco shrugged. I sit where you sit. Hermione sighed. Is that absolutely necessary? Draco gave a curt nod and said, Actually, yes, it is. Theo rolled his eyes but didn't argue the point, and Hermione just sighed and looked forward as the headmistress moved forward for the first years. Hermione watched as the first little girl moved forward and was sorted into Hufflepuff. She clapped, watching as the little girl ran to her table, looking relieved. When the first little girl was sorted into Slytherin, she froze, her face going deathly white. Hermione watched as the rest of the hall went silent, and then stood up annoyed and clapped loudly, elbowing Theo to do the same. He did, and when Draco stood up, the rest of the Slytherins did as well. To Hermione's surprise, Pansy Parkinson walked forward to grab the little girl's hand and bring her to the table, whispering to her as she did. The little girl sank down, and McGonagall nodded, catching Hermione's eyes. Hermione understood that the woman was thanking her, and nodded back with a small smile. 2 more first-years went to Slytherin, both girls who looked terrified until Pansy gave them a pep talk. The last little boy to be sorted went to Slytherin, and Theo got up to go get him, putting him next to Hermione and himself. Hermione smiled at him kindly, but he still looked terrified. Sighing, she said, "Go and find out what Pansy said to the little girls. They calmed down after she talked to them." Theo nodded and stood up, going over to talk to Pansy, who looked up in surprise, and then came over and grabbed the little boy. She was talking to him as she walked over to the other first years, now smiling and looking around happily. Sure enough, by the time he sat down, he was looking proud. Theo grunted, looking annoyed. "How the bloody hell did she do that?" Hermione shrugged. "Who cares, as long as it works?" Theo sighed and sank down, loading food onto Hermione's plate before he served himself. She turned to see Draco glaring at Theo, who actually looked a bit embarrassed. "Sorry, mate," Theo said. Hermione laughed. "What are you sorry for?" Draco didn't elaborate, but handed her a sweet bun. She thanked him and ate her food, deciding that she was never going to understand men, especially Slytherin men. When it came time to leave the Great Hall, she rushed over to Ginny, who smiled at her. "I see you have been lost to the snake den. Are you in Slytherin now? Blaise told us that you lot can switch houses." Hermione shrugged and shook her head. "No, I'm staying in Gryffindor. Why? Did Blaise say he was going to switch houses?" Ginny laughed loudly. "No. He was telling me all about how he was going to clobber me in Quidditch." Hermione frowned. "Wait, will they be able to play? I mean, they are 8 years. That doesn't seem fair." Ginny smirked. "No, they won't be, but they can coach if they want to." Hermione nodded and looped her arm through Ginny's as they walked up. Ginny had made head girl, and she would be sharing a dormitory with Hermione and the 3 other 8th-year boys. "Snake lover." Hermione's head snapped up from her conversation with Ginny to see who'd said that, but they were in too large of a crowd. Ginny hissed in annoyance. "Prat," she said, moving Hermione along. Hermione frowned. "Was he talking to me?" Ginny grunted, her face angry. "Yes, it did not go unnoticed that you sat with Theo." Hermione shrugged. "He's my brother." Ginny sighed. "Which means you have a Death Eater for a father, Hermione." Hermione stopped and turned to look at Ginny, her eyes wide. "Oh, I hadn't thought of that. I don't claim him, just Theo." Ginny shook her head a bit sadly. "Draco was staring at you the whole meal, and that is not going to go unnoticed either. That the Prince of Slytherin is smitten with you." Hermione sighed and shook her head. "You are being ridiculous, Ginny. Draco is not smitten with me." Ginny grinned. "Yeah, that's why you two are engaged. Neville told me." Hermione groaned and shushed her friend. "Not engaged? There is an understanding based on a stupid magic spell that we will absolve as soon as we can." Ginny laughed. "Sure, Hermione. Let's go. I would like for you to explain why I had to hear about my best friend's engagement from Neville and not from her." Hermione flushed and ducked her head as they pushed through the portrait of the fat lady. She obviously had some explaining to do. "Well, it started with too much wine."